Hi friends, Father Carey here. This is another Holy Spirit moment, and this one explores the issue of whether or not you and I possess what the 18th century philosopher Francis Hutcheson called a moral sense. When I speak to people today about morality, generally I find that they will endorse one of three positions. Either they will endorse a position that can be called moral subjectivism, in which they want to say that whatever counts as moral is entirely up to an individual and only an individual, so what's moral for me may not be moral for you, and that's absolutely okay. Or they accept a position of what might be called moral relativism, in which they want to argue that morals change as we move from time to time and culture to culture. So who are we to judge, really? Or they adopt what might be called a position of moral egoism or moral self-interest, in which they argue that what's moral is what's in my best interest. It is, after all about me. If it gives me pleasure, then it's morally acceptable. Okay, fair enough. But what about those situations which we can observe that immediately strike us beyond considerations of subjectivity or relativism or self-interest as either moral or immoral, as either righteous or absolutely wicked? So, for example, if we observe someone torturing an animal, do we not have an immediate revulsion towards that kind of action, a revulsion that we would be willing to call moral disapproval? Or what if we witness someone inflicting a savage punishment upon someone else, a punishment that goes way beyond any boundary of justice or just retribution? Don't we immediately morally disapprove? Or an even easier case, if we see someone bullying a child, particularly if it's an adult bullying a child, isn't our immediate uninterpreted response one of moral disapproval, one of moral condemnation? On the other hand, when we see an individual making a sacrifice, it is a far, far better thing I do than I have ever done before, says Sidney Carton in Dickens' wonderful book, A Tale of Two Cities, when he sacrifices himself in order to help out a friend. Don't we immediately ring with that? Don't we immediately, without interpreting it for 1 minute, say that that is a good action that was performed? Or when we see a simple act of kindness, the proverbial helping the old person across the street, isn't our immediate response one of moral approval? If so, if we can look at a particular action and immediately respond to it with moral approval or moral disapproval, then it just may be, according to Francis Hutcheson, because we are operating under a moral sense. Francis Hutcheson is sometimes called the father of the Scottish Enlightenment. Yes, there was an Enlightenment in Scotland in the 18th century, even though it's not the Enlightenment that we typically learn about. Its leading figures were, for example, David Hume and Adam Smith, both of whom I'm sure you've heard of, and they were terribly influenced by the father of the Scottish Enlightenment, Francis Hutcheson, who was a clergy person and a philosopher. He died in 1746. Now, he writes several books that are extremely influential, and in a few of them, he talks about what he calls the moral sense. This is his argument in brief and very, very simplified. Hutcheson says it is clear to all of us that we have 5 senses, 5 avenues of perception that connect us with really existing things in the outside world. Our sense of hearing, for example, connects us with real sounds in the world. Our tactile sense connects us with real firmness in the world. Our sense of vision with real objects in the world, and so on. These senses, according to Hutcheson, can be described as calm, staple dispositions which show us really objectively existing characteristics external to us, independent of us. Similarly, says Hutcheson, we have what he sometimes calls internal sensations or internal senses or internal modes of perception. There are several of these, but the two that are most relevant for us right now are what he calls the public sense and the moral sense. What he means by the public sense is that whenever we see someone who enjoys something good, or whenever we see someone who suffers from something bad, we immediately feel pleasure in the one case and sympathy in the other. The moral sense is when we see a good action, we are immediately approving of it, and when we see a wicked action, we are immediately disapproving of it. The public sense and the moral sense then are two internal senses or internal kinds of perceptual apparatus that allow us to pick up moral characteristics empirically in the world that exist independently of us. We're not making them up as the subjectivist does. We're not saying that they are nothing more than a product of a culture or a time as the relativist does. And we're not saying that we are approving them because we are interested in them, because they somehow stroke our ego. Because in point of fact, they may not. What underlies this moral sense and this public sense, according to Hutcheson? Well, he wants to argue that we are kind of hardwired with a sense of benevolence, such that our default position is to approve of good actions and to disapprove of wicked actions, to take pleasure in someone's success and to sympathize with someone's failure. And this default position is what guides our internal senses and enables us to be sensitive to empirical, objectively existing moral characteristics in actions and in behavior. Now, what do we do with a person who can look at an animal being tortured and not feel immediate disapproval? Or what do we do with an individual who sees a child being bullied and takes a kind of cynical, indifferent approach to it, much less an approach of pleasure? Well, we can say, can't we, according to Hutcheson, that that person's moral sense is somehow not fully developed. Perhaps the person was born with a broken moral sense, just as some people are born deaf or blind. Or perhaps that person's moral sense has been habituated to coarseness and vulgarity by virtue of the culture in which he or she lives. Just as not having an appropriate response to a moral or immoral action is no argument against the reality of a moral sense, so deafness is no argument against the external sense of hearing, or blindness or myopia is no argument against the external sense of vision. So Francis Hutcheson is challenging us in this way. He is saying, if you can agree with me that there is even one instance in which you see something which elicits from you an immediate, uninterpreted response of moral approval or disapproval, then you've made my case for me. It may not be that all moral judgments can be as immediately observable as some, but if you grant one, then you grant the very real possibility of a moral sense. Let me say one final word about this very intriguing idea. Hutcheson's understanding of the moral sense ought not to be confused with the theory that there exists within us innate or inherent moral ideas, that we're somehow born with ideas of moral goodness that cause us to respond in either an approving or disapproving way when we witness something that is either moral or immoral. Plato in the Meno might be arguing in that fashion, but Hutcheson seems not to be. He isn't saying that we have an innate idea of what's right or wrong. No, he's saying that we pick up with our moral sense what is objectively independent of us, namely a righteous or an unrighteous act, in the same way that you are looking at me right now through your visual sense, or listening to me right now through your hearing sense. So, my friends, let's open our eyes such that perhaps we are more attuned to the reality of righteousness and unrighteousness, morality and immorality, the good and the wicked in the world around us. I think it has a lot to say to not only Christians, but to secular people as well. I recommend Francis Hutcheson, father of the Scottish Enlightenment and champion of the moral sense. I'm Father Carey. This has been another Holy Spirit moment. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. If you have a mind, I invite you to subscribe to this channel. Bye-bye. God bless.